Good morning. Welcome to this Conservation Applied Research and Development, or CARD webinar today, reviewing results from optimizing the new generation of grocery refrigeration equipment. Thanks so much for joining us today for this presentation. I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items before we start. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. We will answer all questions at the end of the presentation, but as questions occur to you, please type them in the Q&A box and send them to all panelists. The Q&A box can be viewed by clicking the ellipsis in the lower right of your screen as indicated on this slide. We will do our best to answer all questions within the time allocated, but if we don't get to some, we will answer them after the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the department's website. The slide set from this webinar will also be made available on the website and will be sent to you directly as a registrant of this webinar within 2 weeks of today's broadcast. And finally, if you'd like closed captionings on this webinar, please click the CC bubble in the lower left of your screen. I am Lindsay Anderson, the Utility Energy Conservation Research Planner at the Minnesota Department of Commerce within the Division of Energy Resources ECO, or Energy Conservation and Optimization Business Unit. In that role, I identify and analyze gaps within utility energy conservation and optimization programs and coordinate and plan research to fill those gaps. And the CARD program is a major tool of that work. With me today is Laura Silver, who is a Principal State Program Administrator within the Energy Conservation and Optimization Business Unit at the department, where she reviews utility energy conservation and optimization triennial plans, as well as annual status reports. Laura is the project manager of the research that is the subject of this webinar, and she'll be moderating the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Our presenters today are Russ Landry from Center for Energy and Environment, Grant Baumgartner from Center for Energy and Environment, and Angela Davis from BEIC. Russ Landry is a senior researcher with CEE, where he has carried out a wide variety of work on energy efficiency in commercial and multifamily buildings over the last 34 years, including working on with multiple Minnesota utilities on commercial refrigeration programs and more than a dozen field research projects. As a research engineer at CEE, Grant Baumgartner conducts research on emerging technologies in HVAC and refrigeration systems. Prior to joining CEE in 2022, Grant spent 6 years developing commercial HVAC and transport refrigeration products. Angela Davis is an engineering consult at BEIC who works on building simulation modeling and creating scripts to predict energy savings. Welcome, Russ, Grant, and Angela to the presentation today. We look forward to hearing about your project. This webinar is one in an ongoing series designed to summarize the results from research projects funded by Minnesota's Applied Research and Development Fund. This fund was established in the Next Generation Energy Act of 2007. The purpose of the fund is to help Minnesota utilities achieve their energy savings goals. $2.6 million annually is set aside for the CARD program, which awards research grants in a competitive request for proposal process. Results from CARD projects provide utilities with data to enhance energy efficiency program designs within their eco portfolios. As you can see by the pie chart, CARD projects funded to date have been in all building sectors, as well as some that cross multiple sectors. The subject of today's webinar is within the commercial building sector, and the presentation will review results from a CARD project that evaluated the savings and program potential for design features mitigating increased summertime energy use in the grocery industry by increasing efficiency of transcritical CO2 systems in Minnesota's climate as the industry moves to the use of carbon dioxide as a refrigerant. With that, I will turn it over to Russ for today's presentation.
I appreciate that, Lindsay, and good morning to everyone else. As Lindsay said, I'm Russ Landry with CE, and I was the principal investigator and project manager for this study. First of all, here's a brief summary of what we'll be presenting today. I'll start with an overview of the project's background and scope, as well as a discussion of our market and technology check-ins and their key findings. Then Grant will outline the field monitoring and empirical savings analysis that he led. Lastly, Angela from VEIC will discuss the simulation analysis that VEIC led, program benefit cost and impact analysis that VEIC led, and also the ECO program recommendations that are based on all the findings from this project's efforts. So we're moving on to my discussion of the project background and market technology check-ins. I'll start out by telling why we chose to put the lion's share of this 3-year project's effort towards a local field study of efficient options for CO2 refrigeration systems. First of all, there's a significant trend towards new CO2 refrigeration systems in grocery stores that was highlighted in a card-funded commercial and industrial refrigeration market study that was completed in 2021 by CE and partners of ours. While it's widely recognized that CO2 systems tended to have lower energy use than other refrigeration systems in cold climates, the flip side of this is that basic CO2 system designs also tend to have higher peak demand in hot weather. While there are a number of system design options that can reduce their energy use and especially their demand in hot weather periods, many of the key demand-reducing CO2 system options are new to the US market and most are exclusive to CO2 systems. This means that there are no utility program precedents for addressing these measures in Minnesota or elsewhere in the US. Lastly, we felt that it was important to perform local field testing both to increase local acceptance and because initial field trials of CO2 system options in the US have generally been limited to warmer climates, where addressing the increased demand in hot weather has a bigger impact on energy use and costs. Now, the short version of why we undertook the study was to provide utilities in Minnesota with information to help them adapt eco programs to take advantage of opportunities unique to CO2 refrigeration systems in grocery stores. Now, here's a brief summary of the steps we took to gather information that would help to best inform eco program developers. We started with an initial market and technology check-in to guide the selection of technologies and sites for field testing. Then we recruited 3 sites and negotiated testing plans and participant incentives. This was followed by a combination of coordinating measure installations and performing detailed field monitoring. Use the field data as a basis for both empirical energy and demand savings analysis, as well as to tune simulation models that provided engineering principle-based savings estimates. The saving results were then used to evaluate cost effectiveness and statewide potential impact. Then, before finalizing our eco program recommendations, we repeated the market and technology check-ins so that we could include the latest information on market developments. Our first activity was to perform a market and technology check-in to get the most up-to-date and technical information, both nationally and for Minnesota's local market. VEIC led the literature review and outreach to manufacturers, while CE talked with local refrigeration contractors, end users, and utilities. The initial round of check-in both guided our prioritization of measures for the field study and provided leads on field study sites. This was really important because we knew that there were, with the very limited number of CO2 refrigerations in Minnesota, it was going to be a challenge to secure 3 test sites. Then near the end of the project, we repeated the market and technology study with outreach that was a little more targeted to focus on the issues that were most critical to Minnesota based on what we had previously learned. Now I'll provide a high-level summary of the check-in findings before digging into specifics for the high priority measures. First of all, we confirmed the previous market study's identification of a trend towards CO2 refrigeration systems and found the trend to be accelerating. We found that there are already at least 30 grocery stores in Minnesota with CO2 refrigeration systems, and a number of contractors reported that CO2 is the most common choice for new grocery store systems. As more regulations are placed against high global warming potential refrigerants in the US, or also known as GWP, there will be a massive push towards low GWP refrigerants, such as CO2, which has a global warming impact of 1. While upcoming and proposed requirements for GWP limits are generally in the hundreds, this makes CO2 a future-proof refrigerant that won't need to be changed out within the lifetime of refrigeration systems that are installed over the next decade. The number of CO2 systems in the US rose from 360 in 2019 to 1,850 in 2023, which represents about 3% of stores nationwide. As this market shift is occurring, it is important for utility eco programs to address the best efficiency upgrade options for these systems. Even though the use has been increasing rapidly, the local market contacts stress that contractor technicians and store staff are still getting used to the differences that come with CO2 systems. So near-term uptake of efficiency measures is expected to be limited to those that are perceived as relatively simple upgrades from the basic CO2 system. When it comes to the specific system level savings options for CO2 systems, we found that most options primarily provide demand savings in hot weather, but little or no savings in cool weather. We also found that the top 5 system level upgrade options for CO2 systems have not been customarily used on other types of other refrigeration systems. This is also true for 2 of the other measures that have gotten recent attention at the national level. Lastly, we didn't find any new developments concerning other cold climate testing for CO2 system refrigerant efficiency options. These first 3 measures were ranked with the highest priority for field testing and were successfully field tested in the study, each of these at one site. Before going into more details about the adiabatic subcoolers, flooded evaporators, commonly referred to as FTE, and mechanical subcooling, I'd like to briefly touch on 2 other measures listed here that received honorable mention among the other options that are commercially available at this time. While these 2 different forms of ejector technology were receiving a lot of national level buzz in the industry at the time of our first market and technology check-in, they were given a second tier rank for 2 key local market reasons. First of all, they were perceived by local store representatives and contractors as being much more complex than the first 3 options, which is still an important barrier given that technicians are still at best just getting familiar with basic CO2 systems. Another key area in the Minnesota market is that the ejector products commercially available at the start of this project were all available from only one rack controls manufacturer, and the ejectors for those could not be effectively controlled by the competitor's rack controller that overwhelmingly dominates the Minnesota market. Contractors and store contacts were very reluctant to consider changing from their familiar standard refrigeration rack system controller just in order to achieve compatibility with one component, especially when you combine that with the complexity of the measure to begin with. Near the end of a study, a compressor manufacturer had introduced a competing ejector product that initially appears to be much more likely to be compatible with the dominant rack controller in Minnesota. Despite this, it appeared that the release of this new product had not yet translated into increased local market interest in ejectors. Now we'll dive deeper into the top 3 priority measures. First of all, adiabatic gas coolers are the most commonly used upgrade option. To understand how adiabatic gas coolers save energy, it's helpful to think of a refrigeration system's purpose as taking heat from a low temperature cooler or freezer where it's not wanted and disposing of that heat to outdoor air. We all know that heat flows from warmer things to colder things. So I like to think of the refrigeration system as moving heat uphill from the refrigerated cases to temperatures well above the outdoor air so that the heat will flow from the refrigerant to the outdoor air before it's recycled through the system and absorbs more heat. The farther the system has to move heat uphill, the more energy the system uses, especially the compressors in the system, which are the workhorse and the main energy user in the refrigeration systems. The flat, solid blue lines in the graph represent the temperatures of the coolers and freezers in a grocery store, while the red line represents a simplified version of the changes in outdoor air temperature over the course of a year. In the summer, the farther the red line is above the blue lines, the more energy the system uses to move the unwanted heat into the outdoor air. Sorry to complicate this more, but the dashed line on the chart shows the minimum refrigerant temperature level needed for the refrigeration system to work properly. So wherever the red outdoor temperature line drops below this dash line, the system must still move heat uphill above the level of the dash line. With the traditional dry gas cooler, the red outdoor air temperature line represents the minimum level that the refrigerant temperature must be brought above. Adiabatic gas coolers save energy by pre-cooling the air going into the gas cooler. This pre-cooling is done by evaporating water into the air as it flows through a wetted media. The blue outdoor wet bulb line shows a slightly exaggerated estimate of how much the air is cooled down as it enters the gas cooler. This pre-cooled air temperature is then a lower minimum level that the refrigerant temperature must be brought above to get rid of the heat. The lower temperature means less compressor energy use when outdoor air temperature is above the dashed lines, representing the minimum temperature required for system operation. You can see that the adiabatic gas cooler benefit is largest in the hottest weather, but it can still provide a modest benefit at outdoor temperatures of about 55 degrees or higher. So that sums up the technical side of how adiabatic gas coolers save energy. And here are the key market findings for adiabatic gas coolers. First of all, by the end of the study, it appears that virtually all new large CO2 systems being installed in Minnesota grocery stores use adiabatic gas coolers. A possible exception to this is small grocery stores, where at least 24 systems with dry coolers are already in place, or air-cooled, dry or air-cooled gas coolers. There's also a high upgrade cost for adiabatic gas coolers, even at the time of installation as part of an entirely new system. While adiabatic gas coolers provide high demand savings and are considered by most local industry contacts as being necessary, they only provide a modest level of annual energy savings in our climate. At the onset of the study, we also found that local standard practice is to only use the water cooling, the pre-cooling when outdoor air temperatures are 75 degrees or higher. This led us to make it a high priority to evaluate the potential savings associated with lowering that wet-dry switchover set point. An interesting development we heard about near the end of the study is that a product was introduced that would convert existing air-cooled gas coolers into adiabatic gas coolers. While this appears to be a promising option with a lower first cost for a number of existing stores in Minnesota, the manufacturer of that product's unresponsiveness to repeated outreach limited the information available to us that we could share with you today. Second high priority measure is commonly referred to as FTE in the industry, and this saves energy by flooding the evaporator or cooling coils with refrigerant and then raising the low end operating temperature of the refrigeration system. This is a repeat of the previous figure with the refrigeration system low end temperature of the refrigerant cooling the coolers represented by the two lower dash lines. The red line with longer dashes represents the temperature of the refrigerant inside the cooling coils in a typical CO2 system. When the evaporators are flooded by the FTE system, the system can remove the same amount of heat from the coolers with a higher refrigerant temperature, represented by the green line with the shorter dashes above it, above the red line. This higher year-round refrigerant temperature provides year-round energy savings. Now I'll try to clarify how the refrigerant temperature can be raised with an FTE system. The diagram on the right shows how a typical cooling coil has primarily liquid refrigerant in only about half of the evaporator coil, and primarily gas refrigerant in the other portion of the cooling coil. The portion of the cooling coil with liquid absorbs much more heat from the air blowing over the coil than the portion with vapor. Just like if you have the same temperature water or air, anything touching the liquid will remove heat a lot faster. With the FTE technology, most or all the cooling coil has liquid refrigerant, so that a lower temperature difference between the air and the refrigerant is needed to absorb the same amount of heat. So they can keep the same temperature in the case, but with a higher refrigerant temperature inside of the coil. This technology provides moderate demand savings in hot weather, but does provide year-round energy savings that most CO2 system-level upgrade options do not. While the approach to using FTE systems is patented by one manufacturer that only has a market share, a modest market share in Minnesota, that manufacturer has expressed the potential to license the approach to other manufacturers. And despite this manufacturer's modest local market share, multiple local contacts expressed a high level of interest in the FTE approach and perceived it as being simpler than many other upgrade options. One last item we considered is that the primary mode of savings for this is similar to the primary mode of savings of one of the ejector technology approaches. So we thought that the results would be relevant to that as well. The last high priority measure is mechanical subcooling. Savings is achieved by using a separate higher temperature coil and subcooling compressor to pre-cool the refrigerant on its way back from the gas cooler. The pre-cooled refrigerant is then able to absorb more heat per pound of refrigerant pumped through refrigeration system's main compressors. The line with a small dash just shows an example of a mechanical subcooler's refrigerant temperature compared to the line with the larger red dashes representing the refrigerant temperature in the coolers. While this mechanical subcooler does use energy, it has a much lower temperature lift or amount that the heat has to move uphill than the main refrigeration system. Therefore, it provides a net energy benefit by adding to the cooling effect by using much less energy than the main compressors would use to provide that same amount of additional cooling. In the field study, this subcooling was carried out by a condensing unit that was packaged with a subcooling heat exchanger located within the same cabinet. With most CO2 system level upgrade options, mechanical subcooling provides significant demand savings, but only modest annual energy savings in Minnesota. This is because it typically only operates in warm and hot summer weather when the system operates above the practical minimum gas cooler temperature by the dashed line in the other diagrams. It is also noteworthy that mechanical subcooling savings is lower when adiabatic gas coolers are used. So we see the primary market for mechanical subcooling is small grocery store systems, especially the existing stores in Minnesota that could be retrofit with mechanical subcooling. Market contacts generally consider mechanical subcooling to be a simple upgrade. It's also noteworthy that the savings mechanisms of mechanical subcooling is very similar to parallel compression, which is another measure, excuse me, with significant national buzz that we categorize as a low priority because of its high complexity and cost. I'll hand it over to Grant Baumgartner to discuss the field monitoring and the empirical savings.
Thanks, Jeff. So for the field monitoring, first I want to emphasize the mapping of the technologies to the site IDs, as I'll be referring to these throughout the field monitoring discussion. Each site was given a letter code corresponding to the first letter of the technology that we were studying. For example, the site with adiabatic gas coolers was site A, so on. Refrigeration system energy use was the primary measurement at each site. An E-gauge monitoring system was installed to measure the power of each of the three-phase medium temperature and low temperature compressors at all three sites. The same E-gauge system was also used to measure the gas cooler power at site F and site M, and it was also used to measure the mechanical subcooler power at site M. The system recorded the averages of power measurements for each 1 minute interval throughout the study. Where possible, additional system operating condition and performance data was also collected from the refrigeration system controllers. Both Site A and Site F use refrigeration controllers that are part of a building automation system to which the store representatives provided our project staff with online access. We use this access in order to collect historical trend data with 1 minute interval readings from each of the equipment controllers. So that's temperatures, pressures, actuator status data that we could download via the building automation system portal on about a weekly basis. We also use weather data from the National Oceanic Atmospheric Observation System to augment the data we're collecting from the building automation system. We download that on a weekly basis, and yeah, pretty much just use that at Site M where we did not have access to the ambient temperature information from the refrigeration system controller. For our empirical analysis, we use linear regressions of system power as a function of temperature to estimate the performance of each measure. I note that for the purposes of the empirical analysis, refrigeration system power here refers to the combined power demand of all the compressors and the gas coolers only. Two piecewise linear regression models predicting the hourly average refrigeration system power demand as a function of hourly average outdoor temperature were created for each site. The baseline model was based on system performance with the measure inactive or prior to measure installation, while the measure active model was based on system performance with the measure active or installed. The regression models were used to predict hourly power demand at each temperature included in a typical meteorological year, TMY 2020 weather data. The annual energy consumption was calculated by integrating these power predictions over time for the 1-year period covered by the TMY data. For hourly data, this was practically equivalent to summing up each of the 8,760 predictions, so 1 per hour of the year. Energy savings were calculated as the difference between the sum of the predictions of the baseline model and the measure active models at each site. Empirical demand savings were evaluated using the same regression models. Selected hours from the TMY data were used to represent periods of peak grid stress. Each regression model was used to predict power demand at these selected hours. The demand savings associated with each measure was the difference between the average predictions of the baseline and measure active models for each site.
And Grant, I just wanted to make a comment. We got a note through the Q&A that you kind of fade out sometimes towards the end of your sentences. So just note that in terms of just maybe loud speaking volume and directness towards your mic. Thank you very much.
Sounds good. Thanks for the note. Okay, moving on to the empirical analysis results. Each measure included in the field testing was expected to provide both energy and demand savings to some extent. The energy and demand analysis reported for the adiabatic gas cooler are based on regression model predictions using water-cooled operation at outdoor temperatures greater than or equal to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The optimizing adiabatic gas cooler control compares data with an outdoor temperature change over a set point of 55 degrees to the as-found set point of 75 degrees. The FTE provides the most energy savings because it improves the efficiency of the refrigeration system in all weather conditions, while the adiabatic gas cooler and mechanical subcooler improve efficiency only at high outdoor temperatures. The measure associated with the largest predictive relative demand savings was the mechanical subcooler. This estimate factors in additional power required for separate mechanical refrigeration systems. The adiabatic gas cooler also shows strong demand savings in Minnesota's climate. While the primary benefit of the FTE system is year-round energy savings, because the power demand of the system is reduced relatively evenly at all temperatures, modest demand savings are associated with this measure as well. So some caveats on the data we used in the field analysis. At site A, the gas coolers were designed to be operated with adiabatic cooling at the highest temperatures. So without wet evaporative media, the gas coolers were undersized to reject heat from the refrigeration system. Therefore, the gas coolers were always operated adiabatically, and to stimulate dry cooling, the gas cooler outlet temperature set point was configured as an offset with respect to dry bulb temperature. The gas cooler outlet temperature set point was limited to 85, so 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So in some cases, the set point in that pseudo air-cooled mode is what we called it, and in adiabatic cooling modes were equivalent. So generally, this was when the wet bulb temperatures were the highest. And in these cases, there was no functional difference between operating modes. So we excluded observations that met that criteria from the analysis. At site F, an issue with our power meters resulted in some data loss for the final few months of the project. This interval was intended to capture mild weather performance with the measure active. Fortunately, we were also collecting power meter data from the refrigeration control system, and it correlated really well with the independent measures we had made up to that point. So we used the refrigeration system power measurements to supplement our own. At site M, it was difficult to obtain reliable control system data. The application we had for accessing data at this site struggled to kind of furnish that data without crashing and had limited memory, so we had to download it more frequently, and it resulted in there being some gaps in our coverage. But when we could extract data, we also found that the timestamps for simultaneous measurements were differed by several hours or more. And these challenges caused us to pretty much just rely on our power meter and weather data to build the models for this site. So essentially the same type of information we're using in the other site, just less additional information from the refrigeration control system. In addition, control strategy that sacrificed refrigeration capacity for some cases, in order to ensure continued operation for most of the cases in the store, resulted in a slight decrease in power demand at the highest temperatures, which was sort of the opposite trend of what you would normally expect. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Angela to talk about the simulation.
All right, so excuse me. 3 sites were modeled using OpenStudio, an open source collection of tools which leverages Energy Plus calculations to create energy models. Each site was a grocery store in Minnesota with a transcritical refrigeration system using CO2 as the refrigerant. The blue graphs here show dry bulb temperature versus medium temp compressor power for 3 versions of the Site F model. The orange graph on the far right shows the meter data. On the furthest left is a mostly prototypical grocery store model with cases, walk-ins, and compressor curves from refrigeration drawings and manufacturer specs. The next 2 graphs show a couple iterations of the model as adjustments were made to better match reality, such as adding air mixing to represent the typical open floor plan of a supermarket sales area, and to fix an issue with abnormally low humidity in spaces causing too little fluctuation in evaporator loads throughout the day. Once the results of the model aligned with the metered data, we started applying scripts written by VEIC to the baseline models to simulate the changes to the building's energy use. For this project, we created scripts to represent adiabatic cooling, mechanical subcooling, and FTE, or full transcritical efficiency. So there are 5 iterations of the model at Site A. Baseline, adiabatic cooling only, mechanical subcooling only, adiabatic with mechanical subcooling, and then both of those with an FTE system. The baseline represents a standard operating transcritical CO2 system with 75-degree Fahrenheit adiabatic cooling. The adiabatic cooling measure shows the savings when the adiabatic cooling set point is changed to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Adiabatic and mechanical subcooling combines the 55-degree adiabatic cooling with the mechanical subcooler. And then the last model combines both of those with an FTE system. The orange bars represent the energy consumption difference from the baseline, with the total percent savings at the end of the bars. The combination of all of the measures yields the highest percent savings at 12.9%. Mechanical subcooling performed better than adiabatic alone, 5.9 compared to 3.9%. The Site F graph shows 4 models, which are the baseline, FTE only, mechanical subcooling only, and then both FTE and mechanical subcooling. The baseline is a transcritical CO2 system with adiabatic cooling set to operate at outdoor temperatures above 55 degrees. The FTE system performed better than the mechanical subcooler, 7.2 versus 6% savings. The combination of them both resulted in 9.6% energy savings, which is lower than the sum of the 2 due to interactive effects. The overall simulation results expectedly showed that the combination of all of the upgrade measures has the highest potential for energy savings. The pair of measures with the greatest savings is a combination of an FTE system with the mechanical subcooling. The combination performs slightly better than an adiabatic gas cooler paired with mechanical subcooling, which is 9.6 compared to 9.3% savings. The empirical results are an actual representation of what was observed on site from metered data. Simulation results are informed by the metered data, but represent optimal operational conditions. The actual versus perfect world analysis approach creates slight variations in the savings for the sites. Some of the gaps between the results would align with additional simulation iterations with more data points, but some of the differences are due to site operations, such as compressor control strategies and staging. The empirical demand savings estimates for the adiabatic and mechanical subcooler sites were also affected by unusual site-specific control strategies that reduced apparent savings in very hot weather. But where that issue was encountered, the information provided by the simulation results were used to support the savings claim. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah. This table shows the empirical and simulated results for the measures with a focus on the metrics that would interest a customer the most. The cheapest and easiest for the customer to implement would be the temperature set point adjustments of an existing adiabatic system. The FTE system has the potential for the highest energy savings. The initial investment for the FTE system is substantial though. Outside of set point adjustments, the mechanical subcooler is the lowest cost measure to install. The BCA tests compare various costs of the measure to their associated benefits they will provide. The ratepayer impact measure test shows the impact of the program on billing rates to the ratepayers. The societal cost test is a test that incorporates broader social and environmental impacts of the measure. The utility cost test looks at the benefits of a measure from the utility's perspective. The participant cost test looks at the benefits of a measure from the customer's perspective. And the Minnesota test has been recommended as a primary economic analysis test for the state. This test aims to update the cost-effectiveness methodologies for energy conservation and optimization by incorporating elements of the other tests deemed valuable to the state of Minnesota. Tests that are passed are highlighted in green. The tests were performed using the previously mentioned costs and potential rebates. All measures passed the Minnesota test and most passed the utility cost test. Here we see the comparison of the measures with a focus on the metrics that pertain to the utility. Based on the market study interviews and installation trends from previous Minnesota card reports and U.S. trends, the number of retrofit and new construction opportunities for each measure was estimated. An approximate amount have been found from those installation numbers. The number of opportunities for temperature setback are higher than the other measures because installers consider adiabatic coolers as standard equipment to install along with CO2 refrigeration systems, with the exception of smaller stores. FTE systems have the highest savings potential due to a combined higher energy savings and moderate future growth opportunities. The administrative costs are assumed to be 16% of the total budget based on historical program operating budgets. Temperature set point adjustment has the lowest cost to the utility due to a smaller estimated rebate. The FTE system has the highest anticipated cost to the utility to implement, but also comes with the highest dollar per kWh generation cost savings. The generation cost savings and the demand cost savings for the utility are based on expected energy savings and scale accordingly. The temperature set point adjustment for adiabatic systems has the quickest payback, with mechanical subcoolers also having a good payback. This table shows the summation of the measure impacts from empirical data. The expected annual savings have been reduced to what a kWh per ton savings may be based on each site's refrigeration capacity. The data again reflects the previous conclusions. The FTE system has the highest savings out of the measures. The adiabatic temperature set point optimization has the lowest cost to implement with a quick payback. Adiabatic systems have good demand savings. The mechanical subcooler is cheaper to install than the adiabatic system or the FTE system, making mechanical subcoolers an economical middle ground between all the measures. The work done for this project was performed to provide information on the savings potential for these measures in hopes that it may support the development of TRM measures. By incorporating these results into a technical resource manual, utilities will have the support to provide incentives for the installation of these measures. The program recommendations in the near term are to implement temperature set point optimization on new and existing adiabatic gas coolers, to develop rebates for the following: retrofit of mechanical subcooling onto existing systems that use air-cooled gas coolers, FDE or flooded evaporators as part of new CO2 system installations, and adiabatic gas coolers limited to retrofits to existing CO2 refrigeration systems, and new system installation in small refrigeration systems. Small in this case meaning stores with less than 60 tons of refrigeration, which are less likely to have adiabatic coolers. And large store CO2 refrigeration systems have been intentionally omitted due to adiabatic gas coolers generally being considered a part of the baseline system design. The last near-term recommendation is to further research the viability of converting existing air-cooled gas coolers to adiabatic gas coolers. The long-term program development effort should look at the following. First, ejectors, especially considering whether the latest product offering addresses the controller compatibility issue, if local market interest increases, and what savings are realized by the various currently available options. And then expanders, especially watching for the near to midterm release of EPTA's XTE system and possible longer-term release of products by Bitzer, then evaluating carefully as more information becomes available.
Thank you so much, Russ, Grant, and Angela for your presentation today. We've come to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So Attendees, if you have not already done so, please type any questions or additional questions into the Q&A panel to send to us to answer. So with that, Laura, are there any questions coming through for Russ, Grant, or Angela?
Okay, well, we'll start off with this question. With only a small number of stores initiating refrigeration systems each year, is it worthwhile to develop a prescriptive rebate when custom rebates or energy design assistance programs could address these opportunities?
I'll take that. This is Russ Landry. I guess in terms of this is something each utility will have to evaluate, but especially for larger utilities, it depends a lot on how easy it is for customers to access the custom and EDA programs. If they're only, the main interest is just refrigeration systems, the EDA programs aren't necessarily designed with that level of to get to that level of detail for that particular technology, and also it's a larger effort that's store wide that the customer may or may not want to access. So I feel like where it's practical, especially for larger utilities, to develop a prescriptive rebate program, it can help a lot in terms of breaking down some of the barriers that customers would have to implementing this technology, either uncertainty in terms of what the rebate might be, and the level of effort required if they have to hire an engineer to do analysis for them, as opposed to just being able to know that if they do this technology, they'll be able to get a certain amount of rebate for that.
Thank you. Victoria asks, is there a plan to get these measures into the TRM? So Russ, why don't you go ahead and take that, and I'll follow up.
Yeah,
perspective from the department if needed.
Yeah, we will be providing detailed information to DER about the savings and the systems where we did the and then I'll, I guess, hand over to back to Laura in terms of what the near and longer term plans might be with that.
Yeah, so Lauren Sweeney, our TRM administrator, I don't believe is on the call. But we, Russ and the team will be presenting to the TRM advisory committee. In fact, we're trying to have all the projects where it's relevant, have more of a connection with the TRM advisory committee. So they'll be presenting and hopefully having a conversation through that forum about this measure in terms of what does the TRM currently look like, and what is the current plan for measures under development, and then having information presented to them to inform that process for future versions of the TRM. So those of you watching the TRM and involved with that, stay tuned for probably a more technical presentation there. I guess I'm still moderating here, so how about this question? Which of these systems can be installed in an existing store?
As Angela had mentioned, the mechanical subcooling is probably the most relevant for retrofit in terms of the lowest cost. Although existing stores that don't have adiabatic gas coolers could theoretically install an adiabatic gas cooler, but it's a very high cost for that. But The one thing that is most relevant is the stores out there that already have adiabatic gas coolers is just optimizing their temperature set point for when they start to use the water to pre-cool the air coming into the gas cooler. That's probably the lowest level in terms of cost and still get some savings in existing stores. One measure in particular that would probably never be practical in existing stores unless they're replacing the entire refrigeration system is the FTE systems. That's because besides there being a change at the rack itself, there's changes in the refrigerant piping between the central rack system and the individual cases, and that there's separate liquid lines for the medium temperature versus the low temperature systems, and also even separate grouping of the suction lines within the medium temperature cases or the coolers.
All right. Do these same measures and results apply to CO2 refrigeration systems in other types of facilities, like ice arenas and cold storage facilities?
Um,
And I guess I'll just add a little bit to that. Can you talk about it in light of facilities that aren't public-facing grocery stores that maybe don't have so many cases for display?
Yeah, right now I know that the manufacturers are working on condensing units that use CO2, but it's not nearly as available, and there's not much product availability for more split system type cooling applications where it might be just like you might see in some smaller store situations or other non-public facing facilities. But in ice arenas, I can touch on certainly the adiabatic gas coolers and the mechanical subcooling would be just as relevant. The FTE system, probably not, because that requires that there's both the coolers and freezers in the system, and so the ice arena would just be running at one temperature. That's a little bit colder than the cooler level in the diagrams that I had talked about. But for cold storage facilities, it's possible that all measures could be applied to that. A lot of cold storage facilities will have both coolers and freezers. It just depends on the specific facility or food processing facilities, what their mix is between coolers and freezers. But certainly the adiabatic gas coolers and optimizing the temperature set point of those it would be applicable to any CO2 systems now, because in general, when I think about CO2 systems now, it's going to be a larger central rack type system as opposed to the more smaller remote condensing unit type systems that serve some of these applications as well.
And one more question here. So if anybody else in the audience has questions, please put them into the Q&A. So what about rebates for using CO2 as a refrigerant instead of the other higher global warming potential refrigerants?
Right now, the way that utility programs are structured, it's not something that we would recommend. There are other jurisdictions where they have a little bit different regulation on that, although I mean most are focused on energy savings, but the general goal of combating climate change would be could be greatly enhanced by providing incentives for going to CO2 refrigerants, because we think of in terms of utility programs, energy savings being the biggest issue, but in this case, the much larger climate impact is from leakage of the refrigerant in the system, and that's what's pushing stores towards CO2, because there's going to be upcoming tighter regulation on the use of refrigerants, which tend to have very high the refrigerants that have been used in the past will have global warming potential of over 1,000, with the standard GWP or global warming potential being 1, and that's for CO2. And even the other kind of in between refrigerants that are being used now are more in the range of the hundreds of GWP compared to the 1 for CO2. So even just moderate avoiding leakage of the other refrigerants from the systems has a huge impact. But in terms of utility programs, the way the policy is in Minnesota right now, it's focused on the energy savings, and doesn't look at the refrigerant leakage issue. And if you look at it in those terms, as I said, even though the CO2 systems will generally have lower annual energy use, they tend to have higher demand. So from a utility program standpoint, there's generally not a great benefit compared to the added cost of going to CO2 systems. There's a lot of added costs because both because of, in general, the CO2 systems have higher pressure piping, so there's a lot of different components in the system that have to be able to handle higher pressures. There's also, besides the rack itself being more expensive and the cases being more expensive, CO2 systems also have to have individual case controllers in each case, which is in each of the refrigerated cases, which is a large added cost for the purchasing of the cases. So there's added costs both in the piping, in the central equipment, and a large added cost in terms of the controls for the cases, and all that adds up to added costs that are really large compared to the potential utility program benefits in the way that it's looked at now in Minnesota.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Ross. Lindsay, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sounds good. Yep, thank you. Thank you, Laura, for moderating the Q&A, and to all our presenters for answering questions. If you have any follow-up questions in regard to this card project, please feel free to reach out to the principal investigators directly, or us here at the department. So with that, I will move on to some closing slides. The slide set, as a reminder, will be emailed to all webinar registrants within 2 weeks of today's broadcast webinar. The recording of this webinar and slide set will also be made available on the department's website, along with the final report when it's completed in approximately a month or so. When available, you can link to either of these from the quick links on our Applied Research and Development webpage, as indicated on this slide. The department's R&D webpage has additional resources and information related to CARD program, the CARD program, and to CARD research projects, which you can check out by going to the web address in the middle of this slide. The CARD website rebuild is now complete. And so to access research before 2020, you navigate to the web links on the left panel, as indicated by the arrow on the left-hand side of the screen. To view those final reports and to access research since 2020, click on the blue button in the middle of the page to look and sort through those. Although the CARD website rebuild is now complete, there are ongoing efforts to ensure that all the research is posted. So do not hesitate to reach out to me if you can't find a final report or a webinar from a past CARD project that you are looking for. And thanks again to all of our attendees for participating today. We appreciate your interest in CARD and CARD projects. I wanted to take a minute to mention an upcoming CARD webinar. On April 25th, Center for Energy and Environment will present on their project Ductless Cold Climate Heat Pumps for Multifamily Applications. And then also to keep aware of upcoming CARD webinars as they are scheduled and other news related to Minnesota's Energy Conservation Optimization Program. Please sign up for the SIP updates listserv through to receive these emails to get onto the email list. You can use the link on this slide in order to do that, or I can also help you navigate to that email list sign up if you need help. In the meantime, contact me if you have any other questions or suggestions related to CARD or CARD webinars. Thanks again for participating today. This ends our webinar. Take care and goodbye.